it's on. My name is Robin Kirk. I'm in the Department of Cultural Anthropology at Duke, and I direct the Human Rights Certificate and have been working with Professor Allison on this series of events, which I come from a human rights focus. As someone who has been thinking more and more about the right to die and the rights of the dead. I want to thank the library and Celeste in particular for hosting us. It's been great to work with the library because we've been wanting at the Duke Human Rights Center to have more of our events and more of our outreach off campus and in the various communities that Durham has. So it's really wonderful to be here. And it's wonderful to host Matthew Mazzuchelli, who's going to be our speaker tonight. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was passed in 1948, enshrines a right to life, but it says nothing about a right to death. In fact, it was never even discussed in the negotiations that led to the Declaration. And it also says nothing about the rights of the dead themselves. Yet in virtually every culture and every historical period, the dead demand that the living perform certain tasks or rituals. A growing number of scholars and practitioners are beginning to ask, can we phrase this as rights, akin to the right to life or the right to a fair trial or the right to vote? There is an economic factor at play here as well. And Matthew's going to talk about that a little bit in his presentation. Funeral costs, like everything else, are rising in the United States. So is the incidence of unclaimed dead. Reliable national data on unclaimed dead in the U.S. are sparse since states record and define unclaimed very differently, but recent estimates suggest 2 to 4% of the roughly 3 million people who die in the United States annually, up to 114,000 people, now go unclaimed every year. In Los Angeles alone, about 1% went unclaimed in the 1970s, and that's now over 3%. In North Carolina, the state takes responsibility for the unclaimed dead. After a prolonged waiting period, those remains are cremated, and the ashes are scattered at sea on an annual voyage by a state boat, managed by the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner of the state. Matthew Mazzuchelli, as I mentioned, is a licensed funeral director and decedent affairs coordinator at South Shore Health in Boston. He treats these conditions not as bureaucratic failures, but as violations of the inherent rights of the dead, to dignity, to care, and to remembrance. He founded the Black Tie Coalition, a nonprofit that partners with legislators and funeral professionals to advocate for affordable death care and to recognize dignity in death as a fundamental human right. Mazzuchelli's work situates death care within the larger struggle for human rights and social justice. After Matthew's talk, we're going to have a question and answer session moderated by my co-conspirator, Professor Allison, who is Professor of Cultural Anthropology at Duke University, and I'll introduce her once we start the Q&A. But please join me in welcoming Matthew Mazzuchelli.
Well, thank you for having me, of course, and thank you for making this happen, because I think it's a really important issue that not many people are aware of, and I think once people become aware, it'll certainly grab some attention and hopefully resolve at least a little bit. So I'm going to start off with a quote here from my good friend Bill Spencer, who has really done a lot for the Black Tie Coalition. He has cut prices exorbitantly for us and for the families and the individuals that we serve. So it says, "They say you judge a society by how you treat your dead. If that's the case in Massachusetts, we're in a pretty bad society." And one thing to mention about Bill Spencer is he is a funeral director in South Boston, and he high volume indigent cases. So he's really fighting for the rights of the indigent and has been going up against the state for, I would say, 20 years now. So he was eager to help us, and he's been fantastic. So let's kind of jump into the issue here. So there's no real definition of what is unclaimed, what is abandoned, what is indigent. And for the purpose this lecture here, and for any issue involving this moving forward, I think you can kind of use them interchangeably because they're almost always going to have the same sort of pathway to final disposition. So as it says here, under MGL, under Massachusetts general law, there's no unified statutory definition. And so they appear in fragmented contexts. You could say that unclaimed is a decedent whose next of kin cannot be identified, located, or persuaded to act. Abandoned is someone whose next of kin or responsible party are known, but they refuse or fail to act, which it might sound a little crazy, but this is actually fairly common. Indigent, of course, they might have family, but they're just unable to pay. Paying anywhere around the $2,000 range for the cheapest cremation will really hurt them. It will really set them back a few months, and it's not going to be easy for them to come up with that money. So if I were a lawmaker, this is just what I would define unclaimed indigent abandoned as. Unclaimed, abandoned, and indigent dead refers to any deceased individual for whom, 1, no legal authorized person or institution has assumed responsibility for the final disposition of the remains, or no adequate financial resources exist to cover the reasonable cost of burial or cremation, and no public authority has yet exercised its duty to ensure timely and dignified disposition. In this little subnote down here, the terms unclaimed, abandoned, and indigent shall be construed jointly and interchangeably, as I was mentioning before. And so most people, if I ask just the average Massachusetts resident, what happens when someone dies without family or dies in a hospital and there's animosity between the family and they just decline taking custody, they'll always say, oh, the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner will take them. But that's not true, because the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner will really only take cases that fit something around these circumstances here. It's a criminal violence. The person is extremely young, maybe an infant or child. The person's fairly young, maybe 40 to, I would say 40, under 45 typically. And that's not even a guarantee that they'll take them. It's just that they'll look into the case a little bit. And so, again, that's not true. That's not what happens. So this is what I do in my scope as the Decedent Affairs Coordinator at South Shore Hospital. When someone passes away, typically the doctor or pronouncing nurse, a PA, they'll have to get in contact with the family or the emergency contact. And so, as you can see here, the person passed away, the doctor's with him. He's going to go ahead and call the family, but there's no family. So where I come in is I have to locate the family or locate someone or make the attempts to locate someone, reasonable attempts, to track them down, try to at least get a signature. I'm not looking for any sort of finances at this point. I just want a signature so that the hospital can proceed with the cheaper option of cremation. Because unfortunately, when there's no next of kin, the default is burial, meaning we have to get burial space, we have to pay for the burial space, and then we have to pay the funeral home for their services. So it would typically look like this, about $4,500 to the funeral home, and then the cemetery needs their money too, and they cut us a deal for $3,500. We purchase the grave, and then we also cover the opening and closing of the grave fee. So the workers come in, they dig the grave, they fill it in. And so in my scope as the role of the Decedent Affairs Coordinator, when a patient dies, they're brought down to the morgue. And my rule of thumb is typically if I see there's no action within 5 to 10 days or so, there's a red flag in my head, a bell starts to go off, because that's not typical, and so I'll start to keep an eye on it. It's not always the case. Sometimes the family is just getting things together, but the 5 to 10 day range is when I start to think this person's going to be unclaimed or abandoned or something's going on. So I at least start looking into the chart. I start looking into, do they have an emergency contact? Do they have family listed? And then I would just begin the detective work, essentially, and use Ancestry, public databases, of course, after exhausting the efforts to speak with the emergency contact. And sometimes the emergency contact will be a friend or maybe a healthcare proxy. something like that, and it'll sometimes lead me to another person that can tell me what's going on. And then what I do is I document everything, every day, every attempt. And that is so the funeral home will agree to take the decedent into their care because the funeral homes are very worried about liability. They call it someone coming out of the woodwork. So they say, well, Matt, we don't want to do something now and then have a family member come back years later and sue us. All the funeral homes are getting afraid of getting sued. And so once I kind of document everything, I show the funeral home. In the range varies for how long it takes for them to actually act. It's definitely over 30 days, excuse me. And so once they agree, they come pick up the decedent, and then they literally bring a casket to the hospital rather than a stretcher, and they take the person from the hospital morgue and they put them into the casket. It's typically a damaged casket, whatever they can get, and then they just drive straight to the cemetery. And then, of course, we'll eventually pay them. And that's how the process works right now. But this actually took me a fair amount of time to figure out because as coming into the hospital as a funeral director, of course, the funeral home that I worked for didn't take any of these cases, so I've never experienced having someone who doesn't have any family because a good funeral director will ask who's the next of kin, who's going to be paying for this. And now a lot of funeral homes are asking for money up front before they even dispatch someone to the hospital or to the place of death. So it really is, the funeral home does have the right to say, no, we're not taking that case. There's too much liability. But eventually they will proceed with burial. It costs the hospital around $8,000 per decedent to bury. If I can find a next of kin, sometimes I can convince them to sign at least an authorization for cremation, but a lot of the times they think I'm trying to get them to be financially responsible, and it takes a lot of reassurance to let them know that we're really just looking for you to authorize the cremation. The other major type of case, the main type of case I come across is a family animosity. So if they do have family that's listed on their chart, I will give them a call, and the family, if they tell me they want nothing to do with it, I have to listen. I can't keep calling them because right now in Massachusetts, there's nothing written, there's nothing in place for when this comes about. I remember when I was first trying to figure this issue out, I was calling the medical examiner, I was calling lawmakers, I was trying to see what I should be doing in my scope as a decedent affairs coordinator when this happens, and they were just kind of just redirecting me to this person, and I kind of had to figure out my own method and gain the trust of certain funeral homes that would work with us. But long story short, the hospital is paying after, let's say, 60 to 90 days, sometimes more, for these decedents to be taken out of the hospital and buried. And so I did a little research of the morgue log from 2023 to 2024 or so, and I logged everything that I saw, every decedent in the morgue that was over a certain amount of days that I thought was a little bit too long. So I think it was 30 days. So I think a little bit of it got cut off here. Oh. So yes, this is April. You can see that there's someone in there for 36 days, and there's so many little dots here that they're all kind of blending together, but each dot is a person being checked into the morgue. And so, okay, you have someone there for 36 days, you have one person there for 108 days, and you can see just in this year, and it's gone up since then, this is 2023 to 2024, there's a fair amount of people in a community hospital that are there for a fairly long time. And then what these purple lines are incidents where the emergency morgue had to be activated. So when it was implemented during COVID times, when the morgue was reaching capacity, they had to activate the alternate morgue, which is a trailer, the trailer of a truck, and it's refrigerated. So every time the emergency morgue has to be activated, it diverts a whole lot of resources from patient care over to activating the emergency morgue. They have to get the engineers to start up the refrigeration units. They need NAs and anyone who can help to start bringing the decedents out of the hospital morgue into there, or just start transferring people into the alternative morgue. So post-COVID, this to me is not good, that the emergency morgue has to be activated this much, but it riles people up. It gets everyone a bit on edge. It can happen at any time. And so this is all because of the overlap of long-term decedents. If it's a 16-space morgue, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You have 6 people in there that are unclaimed. And that's 6 morgue spaces that could have been used. People like to think of, and lawmakers especially, like to think of hospital bed numbers as being something, the main issue to worry about. But I always like to tell them, what about morgue spaces? They're not really thinking about that. They're thinking about bed numbers and everything that impacts the living. And so this gentleman is truly my role model. This is Peter Stefan. He was known for burying the abandoned, the unclaimed, the indigent. He buried the Boston bomber. He just really believed in dignity and that everyone deserves some sort of final disposition, something final, whether it's cremation, whether it's burial. And so he has been in the news a lot because he has gone to various news stations when he was alive, and he would try to explain this to them. And even with all the articles that he got published, it never really stuck. And there was just the politics of Massachusetts was more or less working against him. And we'll get to the reason for that in just a little. So I just want to kind of put this into a human perspective and give some real examples with just a little bit of details changed, just to keep them anonymous. So this is Stephen. He's divorced. He has an ex-wife. He has no children. He was staying in a friend's apartment in Brockton. He's typically homeless, but sometimes this friend would let him stay there with her. And so he passed away, and the police showed up. So when it's an unattended death, the police typically show up and they can pronounce at the scene. And what they would do in a situation like this is they would call the chief medical examiner. And the chief medical examiner can decide to take the case, or they can decide not to take the case. So at 9 a.m., the police arrived. They declared him dead. They called the OCME, and the OCME is going to ask, what do you see? What's the circumstantial evidence? And they said there's a oxygen tank. The friend is telling me he has COPD. And so the medical examiner, they do have a backlog themselves. It's almost similar to an insurance company, where an insurance company might not want to pay out a claim, and then they might start looking into reasonable where they might not have to pay out the full amount. So it's similar to the medical examiner is similar in that sense, because they really do have a strained backlog, and they don't want to have to accept every single case that comes in. So that was enough for them. The circumstantial evidence, they declined the case. With the oxygen tank nearby, they can conclude that he didn't use his oxygen. So the police, they now have to try calling a next of kin or find someone to call the funeral home. Ideally, the funeral home or the police shouldn't be engaging the funeral home. It typically has to be a family member, but in this case, the police just began calling around 10 a.m. All the funeral homes were declining. I think I read in the report, I think they called about 30 funeral homes all throughout Massachusetts. And this is in Brockton, Massachusetts, so this is near Boston. And finally, by 6 p.m., they found Peter Stefan, the gentleman I just showed you. They were told that he typically helps out in these situations. So he's in Worcester, he's in central Massachusetts, and so he was willing to drive all the way out there, knowing that there's no money guaranteed for him. I don't think he had refrigeration. If he did, it was very minimal. So he has to bring this person back to the funeral home and try to find out, or try to figure out a way to get this person buried. And again, it has to be burial when there's no next of kin, because there's no authorization to cremate. And so just another quick case, we have a gentleman who has money. He felt sick, he went to the hospital, and he died 2 days later. In this case, he had a healthcare proxy listed, and the healthcare proxy was his neighbor. And his neighbor told me that he was just a very isolated man. He was very lonely, and he asked the neighbor to be the healthcare proxy, and she didn't really, at the time she signed it, she wasn't really sure what that entailed. And so now you have someone who's not a family member, knows this person as a neighbor, and is not comfortable proceeding with arrangements. She tells me he has assets, but unless you have a death certificate, you can't get those assets. You can't access any of that, nor do you have a next of kin or someone willing to figure all that out in probate and deal with that. So as to what happens to his money, it most likely went to the state. But again, this was a case where you have a healthcare proxy, you don't have any family, and it's, what do? It really, you kind of have to be creative, and it's just ad hoc judgment of what to do in each case. So this was another typical example. And again, I just explained this briefly, so everyone asks, why not cremate these people? And it's illegal under the current state law. You can't do that without next of kin authorization. The crematories won't touch any paperwork that's not signed by the next of kin or the person who has authority. And so there have been proposals to change this and change the law. And one thing I found interesting was the lobby that was opposing all these bills that didn't even have to do with cemeteries was the Massachusetts Cemetery Association. And so right now the cemeteries in Massachusetts are operating under nonprofit status. So that means the report to if there was some sort of consumer report or something you wanted to complain about, you would take it to the Attorney General, who's a hard person to reach. So they have that. They also have no oversight board. They have no one really checking their finances, or if they check the finances, it's going to be minimal. They'll have their accountant make it look real pretty and real nice to put online. But it really raised some questions to me as to why they were. And you can track lobbying spending, and you can see how much they spent in 2019 to get this bill quashed. And it was around $20,000. The Massachusetts Cemetery Association is composed of all of the cemetery owners in Massachusetts. And it's, as I was saying, it's a nonprofit organization. Most of them are grandfathered in. Most of them want to keep it that way. It's very comfortable for them. And so I didn't really understand how big of a role the cemeteries played until I started thinking about, well, the cemeteries are in Massachusetts separate. They are very distinct from the funeral homes. You can't intermingle. So they're kind of in a land of their own. And this bill, I've read what was proposed, and it sounded amazing to me. There would be a cemetery oversight board like what you have down here in North Carolina. You have a board of cemetery directors, or a cemetery board that gives them compliance regulations and things they need to follow. In Massachusetts, that's non-existent. And so I think so that really sums it up as to just a high-level briefing of what the issue really is and what kind of questions this raises. So I think now is a good time to take some questions.
Let me just do a quick intro of Anne. Thank you. That gives us a lot to think about. So we're going to have Q&A, and Anne is going to moderate for us. She's a cultural anthropologist whose work interrogates how societies in late capitalism navigate loss, precarity, and the boundaries between life and death. She authored, among other books, Being Dead Otherwise, an amazing book, which is a landmark study of Japan's shifting mortuary practices. The book won the John Whitney Hall Book Prize from the Association for Asian Studies in 2025, this year, for the best English language book about Japan. To quote Anne,
just that year.
Just that year. The book uses Japan as a case study of possible futures in the weaning, transforming, and redesigning of others in the management of the dead. Her current focus in her research is on death care, and she's examining what dignity, responsibility, and memorialization mean when social bonds collapse, as Matthew's been showing us here, as it's happening in the United States, showing that the dead are not outside the social world, but central to how the living value care, memory, and justice.
Thanks, Robin. Thank you so much. And thank you, Matt. That was wonderful. So I just thought it would be... I think the map, there it is. A little closer here, okay. So I thought it would be, we have so many friendly faces in the audience, and so I don't want to monopolize the discussion, but I thought it would be interesting to raise just a few questions that your incredibly interesting work and your positioning in all these multiple ways gives you access to. So I thought that I would start with the yes. So Rob had introduced this talking of human rights, and this is an initiative that we've been working on, the human rights, the dying, and the dead. And in my field, anthropology, and people will say that taking care of the dead is something that suits humanity. That people started taking care, doing something to memorialize the dead as long as maybe 20,000 years ago. And people will say that that is not only important, that it kind of constitutes the difference between being human and not human. And that animals don't do that, although I guess some animals do. But it raises interesting questions about why do we take care of the dead? Because in some sense, the dead are no longer biologically alive. And what would it mean to no longer take care of the dead? Would that mean, is it a question of decency or dignity or... So that's just kind of hovering in the background. Would you like to just comment on that?
Yeah, of course. So, you can answer that in quite a few ways. You have the religious aspect to it. For many years, religion has really controlled, what we should do when it comes, time for burial. Amongst, all different types of religions, and that has to do with, I was a Jewish funeral director for quite some time. I'm not Jewish myself, but I worked for many Jewish funeral homes. And what I noticed is that their strong belief in the soul, that the soul hovers over the body for a certain amount of time, really drove them to, put a lot of care into, burying their dead, burying their community members. The Hever Kadisha, which is the burial society, steps up and they recognize that as a member of their community and that they need to do something. They feel as though it's a need. But besides the spiritual aspect, I think, as you were saying, animals even do. There's some animals that might do it, and I think it's a primal instinct kind of in us, where we almost sometimes can't even explain why, but we as humans need to bury our dead for one reason or another. And I also think it's important to memorialize them too, because if we didn't memorialize them and didn't have some sort of celebration of their life, we could easily forget some incredible ideas. If you stop talking about that person. Actually, Anne's husband does work in West Africa, and he was telling me last night how they don't even speak the name of the people after they die. And what I was thinking is, what if that person had some great ideas and or really bad ideas, and you can't bring up that person's name and say, remember this person said this, and they came up with this amazing idea. And so it also memorializes those person's ideas and values, and it kind of guides us as a society. If we forgot about them, we would forget all that they achieved, and even the bad stuff we would forget, and we would forget anything associated with that person, what not to do.
So, switching gears a little bit, and also thinking about, so as Rob said, I've done all my work in Japan. And in Japan, in recent years, there's been kind of a shift. So it used to be that people took death incredibly seriously, and people took the family incredibly seriously. And so you would always be buried and memorialized and cared for and tended to by your family. And you would be put into a familial grave or an ancestral grave, and your living kin would be responsible for visiting the grave and cleaning up the grave, bringing flowers, and doing Buddhist memorial for 33 years. At which point it was thought that the soul, as you're talking about the spirit, would then transition to either Buddha God or an ancestor. You would literally become an ancestor, and you would join all the other ancestors in the grave. But what has happened, to the question of why do you even have, what happens to taking care of the dead? And why do you have unclaimed dead or indigent dead or abandoned dead? In the case of Japan, what has happened is that increasingly since about 1990, 2000, high aging population, low birth rate, people are not partnering as much, they're not getting married as much, they're not having children as much, but people continue to age. So you have an increasingly aging population that is also single. So there are a lot of solo seniors, and they don't have kids, they don't have partners. The family is no longer as viable. And in the absence of the family to take care of the dead, you have a rise of abandoned dead. And so this is what's happening in Japan, is that the system that was responsible for taking care of the dead is no longer sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder, you mentioned the family, you mentioned people who don't have family to also step up to the base. Do you think that's the main factor for an increase in unclaimed debt, or do you think in the case of the United States there may be other reasons that are generating the rise of abandonment? And you mentioned something that came to my class today, and you also said that what you are finding is that sometimes when you phone and people pick up and they are kin, they may be a strange kin, if they've had an issue, they'll say, no damn way am I gonna pay. And so there's also there's increased hostility. That's interesting, and we were trying to wonder where that's coming from. So I was wondering if you could remark on that.
Yes, and it is interesting because I've talked to funeral directors who have been doing this their whole life, and they said, Matt, this is, the past 10 years or so is really the first time I've run into this issue. As Anne was saying, I would say about half the cases of the unclaimed are due to family animosity. And in certain situations, I'll just mention the person's name, and they'll tell me not to call back. So, whatever this person did to that family member, the animosity there is just enough to where they just straight up decline disposition or custody. So they want nothing to do with this person. Even in my own family, we had an uncle that was crazy about him, but when he passed away, everyone reluctantly got together and we said that we have to do something. You can't just do nothing. But there are families out there who are perfectly fine with doing nothing. Maybe if they knew what would happen to them, that would change their opinion. The other thing in the case of Massachusetts is that the laws that are in place are written for the nuclear family. They're written as if all the families are getting along and all happy-go-lucky. And I have this old textbook about the cadaver laws from the 1950s, and this gentleman, this law professor, was proposing that due to past case law at that time, he believed that there should be some sort of punishment imposed for refusing to take disposition if it's not for financial reasons. And so I was reading that and just kind of trying to get into the mindset of what it was like back then in the 1950s, and we strongly believe that. So I could see the laws were written at that time where that's coming from, but we don't take into account this type of family animosity that we see today. And I can't answer if it's recent. There's many factors that I'm not an expert in that could be contributing to the amount of family animosity, but it's definitely enough for multiple families of different demographics to say decline disposition.
Why don't I just ask one more question? As I can see that you're all eager to ask questions. So on this issue, what you find in Japan, and I think you're finding it in the United States too, is that if there's someone who's unclaimed, it's only a kin who can claim it. And so sometimes in the case of Japan, you might have a friend, or you might have someone who is actually willing to be responsible. But by law, they can't step in because it is only defined very narrowly as biological kin. And often it's not even partners, would not even be legible, or they wouldn't be acceptable. And the book, The Unclaimed, that Pamela Prickett and Seven Timmermans wrote 2 years ago about the unclaimed in LA County, so that they also found that if it's so narrowly defined that to be responsible, you have to be kin, that you would think changing that law or changing the expectation to flexibilize it so that it's not just rigidly biological, that would be one thing to do. So one of the questions would be, who's responsible for the dead? I mean, one of the questions for human rights, if we would all agree that the dead have the right to a dignified burial or ending, who's responsible for delivering that? Who's responsible for doing the work? Who's responsible for care? Who's responsible for paying for that? So that would be another question that we could ask everyone. But
Yeah, so I know it was proposed for Massachusetts to have a right to disposition statute. And what I think, and this is just what I think, is that there's certain people that know exactly what's going on, and there's certain people that are benefiting greatly from this financially. And I think, that bill should have, of course, been unanimously accepted, but it was opposed. And it just, this is what really makes me dive into this and scratch my head, because I just, that bill that was proposed would have allowed a friend to step up. It would have allowed someone willing to take, custody there and step up. And it's not even saying that they have to be financially responsible. So, I mean, it's things like that that kind of really make me want to hammer away at this to the lawmakers and just really keep pushing it, because there has to be some sort of reason why this bill was opposed. But I think the financial aspect of it, that is a very good question, because I don't really know which way to lean, because I don't know if we should lean on the state for it. Is that something the state should do? Is that something that should we allot a budget to the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for them to handle the financial part? But either way, Massachusetts requires a funeral home to be involved in order to generate the death certificate, to get the burial permit, get everything they need for a burial. So it's a very multifaceted question that there's so many different options you could have for the financial part, which is the most important part, unfortunately, that motivates the funeral homes to act and the cemeteries to act. The cemeteries, if they wanted to, as a nonprofit, they should be providing some sort of public service, and I would think that they should allot at least a certain amount of graves for the unclaimed, what they used to call Potter's Fields, which we do have down here in North Carolina. I was talking to a funeral director shortly before I came in, and I was pleasantly surprised at how drastically different the laws are. There's an open market for cemeteries, and anyone who wants to get in to the business, if they wanted to, they could. So there's many different solutions for it. I just don't have all the answers for there, because there's just too many.
why don't we open it up?
Yeah, Peter.
Robin's gonna give you. Could you all just quickly tell us who you are? Thank you.
My name is Lauren. I lead a death cafe, or we both do. So we've talked about some of these topics, but the question that I had was pulling directly on the thread about finances. So if somebody dies in a hospital, they're getting care through Medicare, Medicaid, in Massachusetts through state health insurance or something like that. It seems fairly logical that money, there could be a benefit associated with the death there. Does that not exist in Massachusetts?
I'm very glad you asked that, because I did not bring this up in the presentation, but in 1983, the Department of Transitional Assistance offered a $1,100 financial assistance program for people who are on Mass Health and for people who qualify for it. And since 1983, that number has been unchanged. And again, there's been bills proposed to increase it. I mean, they have not come through. But it's $1,100 towards the funeral if the funeral home is below $3,500. And they really do everything they can not to give that money. They'll say, oh, well, this person had a car. We're going to take that off the bill. We're going to somehow value it. And we're going to take that off the $1,100, which won't do much for the funeral director anyway. He's not going to be able to do much. He won't be able to complete disposition with that $1,100. I've heard cases where they go into that person's bank account and there's $4.02 in there, and they'll take that off the $1,100. So for some reason they're trying really hard and not to give this money. And I think the Funeral Consumer Alliance did a survey, and they asked if the funeral homes accepted DTA assistance, and I would say
DTA's Department.
yeah, the Department of Transitional Assistance. So that's the agency that would give this $1,100, and I would say about 90% of the funeral homes said no, and that was maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, and I would say now I know of 3 in the whole state that are willing to work with the DTA assistance program. So it's there, it's just not very useful.
Stop loud.
Yeah. We're recording too, so. Thanks.
No. Hi, my name's James, and I guess this sort of topic is on my wife's mind and mine because we're thinking about end-of-life planning and thinking about options for ourselves and things like that. So thank you very much for your words. I'm wondering, your role is decedent care advocate?
The CARES coordinator?
Sure. Do you work for this hospital? Is that
Yes. So I'm a funeral director that works for the hospital. So it's fairly new in the Boston area.
So thinking about who cares and who should care, why does the hospital care? Why does the hospital have this role for you? I'm glad they do.
Yes.
But what's their motivation as an institution? Can we localize this kind of care in an institution somehow? Because it seems to be that way a little bit.
Yes. So they came up with this role fairly recently, modeling the General Hospital, because there's a few hospitals being sued for mishandling funeral remains. So that's also part of my role too. So,
Mishandling because they just put them in industrial waste.
exactly. So mishandling.
Yeah, mishandling.
Because we have very specific laws about it. If it's under 20 weeks, under 350 grams, then the family has the option to take disposition, which most of them don't. And so when they don't take disposition, that is going to sound bad, but it goes up with medical waste. That's a main part of my job too, is kind of overseeing the that policy, the mooring policy, things like that. So hospitals just started adopting this. The hospitals don't want to pay for it. I have to really have a good presentation for the board to say.
So you advocated to get the job?
I advocated to get a budget for paying for the unclaimed, and I think what we settled on was about $70,000, and we need more than that, but I was happy to start with that. So it's and other hospitals call the Black Tie Coalition. So in my capacity as the Black Tie Coalition, as the president of that coalition, I'll have smaller community hospitals call me, and this is their first time dealing with this issue. It's rare, but the fact that it's reaching suburban areas in towards Western Massachusetts is kind of saying something to me, because they don't have decedent affairs coordinators. This is a job that's mostly local to Boston. Whatever Mass General Hospital does, all the other hospitals do.
Can I ask you a question? But every hospital is going to have bodies that die and no one claims them.
Mm-hmm.
So what do other hospitals do?
So what other hospitals do is they don't have a contract with the funeral home. The smaller town funeral directors that aren't corporate, there's corporate funeral homes out there, but the ones that aren't corporate, and there's still those stereotypical funeral directors that are willing to do anything to help. A lot of them will just pick that person up and then have it be their problem. But we're seeing a lot less of that. And that's why the hospitals are starting to call them, because these funeral homes that they formerly would call when it would happen every now and then, these funeral homes are starting to say no. Because what my advice to the hospital is to these other hospitals is to, unfortunately, you're gonna have to budget for getting this person buried, and you have to explain to them pretty much everything that went through here, because it's someone who's not a decedent affairs coordinator. It's typically the hospital social worker trying to help out the family. So this very well might be a job, and it might be a job that spreads through all hospitals, seeing as though the number of the unclaimed is certainly rising.
Thank you for this talk. Thank you for the talk. It was really fascinating. I guess I'm wondering, obviously it's hard to get people while they're alive to think about what might happen after their death. And I think there has been a very successful move to advocate for people to sign end of life decision forms, right? To think about what might happen if they're not competent anymore to make decisions. And so I guess I'm wondering if there's been an effort to do that, or whether that action matters, but the person themselves might have wanted to sign off, for example, on cremation in advance, or whether that might be part of a health insurance policy if the insurance companies do have any financial investment in this. It might be, I guess I'm just wondering what the role of the still living is, and whether there have been efforts to move them to make this easier access.
Do you mind if I answer first? Do you mind if I answer for Japan?
Sure.
I don't know if this was specific to the U.S. or.
I turned it off, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this very issue is one of the things that I really work on in the book, because in Japan people are so worried about this precisely thing happening to them. But there's been a lot of advanced planning, and people will go to information sessions and they'll sign up ahead of time, and they'll go to multiple information sessions, and they'll get together and form friendships. And the one place that I work with, they form friendships that are called grave friends. I mean, they get together and they're laughing and they're thinking about exactly this, because they realize that they don't anticipate and prepare and make plans, that it could be that there'll be a claim, and that would be a really unsavory ending. So there's a lot of stuff happening in Japan around this very issue. And I know with death cafes, it would seem that people are starting to talk about it more here. But, okay.
Yeah, so I did pre-planning for a little bit. I had my life insurance license. And so one situation that stuck out to me and kind of generated some ideas was this mother had a daughter that was disabled. She was in a group home, and the mother was wise enough to come in to, pre-plan the daughter's funeral, so that if and when something happens and the mother's no longer there, something's in place, and we have to follow that. And so, it just, because you have to be wise enough to think to pre-plan, and a lot of people don't even want to talk about the topic, and it also depends on the culture. I know with the Jewish faith, pre-planning was very big, because in the Jewish faith, they say it's similar to winning the lottery. If you think you're going to win the lottery, you're not going to win the lottery. So they kind of have that attitude towards it, where some people will even lay out their burial clothes and really make sure it doesn't happen anytime soon, because they're showing God that they're really anticipating it happening sometime soon. And so when I was at the Jewish funeral, there'd be 3 or 4 families a day coming in to pre-plan. With my dad I come from an Italian American family, so my dad I bring it up to him all the time, and he blocks his ears and doesn't want to hear it. And so there's certain people like that too who don't want to hear it. But having done pre-arrangements and seeing when the funeral actually happens after pre-arrangement, I can't recommend it enough. Not only financially, but just saving that burden on your family. Financially, you lock in today's price. So if you're going to pre-plan a funeral in 2025, you're only going to pay 2025 prices. And seeing as the funerals, or the cost of the funerals, rapidly rising, like doubling every 3 years, something like that. It's rising exponentially. I think it's very, very wise if you have the forethought to pre-plan to do it. And so, and one of my ideas that was generated is going into some of these people that could be prone to being unemployed, like group homes or certain facilities, and just pre-planning for them, getting something in place, getting them to authorize something. Unfortunately, self-authorization in Massachusetts is no longer legal, but so they're still going to need someone to sign off if it is a cremation.
I'm Allison. I co-facilitated a death cafe. I have so many different questions, none of which are related, so I'll just do one to go. It seems as though Massachusetts is assuming that we can just claim all the unclaimed dead bodies as Christian. It sounds very much like they're going to Christian burial, which is
Right.
It's a conflict for me to think that is a universal dignified death. Because I also imagine that if you were to solicit other religious resting places for dead bodies, there would be a huge uproar if you assumed it would be okay for them to rest in peace in some other faith. So just that strikes me as extraordinarily uncomfortable. I also, I guess, have a question. I don't know how to phrase this one, so I have a pile of words to give you, which is, there is a state interest in the hygiene and health of we can't have dead bodies. I mean, we can't have dead deer laying out on the highways forever. We cannot leave bodies unclaimed. So there's a very valid stake for the state to be invested in the safe, if not dignified, removal and treatment of dead bodies. Has that ever been addressed in the bills or considerations about this thing?
Yes. So to your first question, I pry into that, and the answer I get is that, and I guess technically it makes sense, but the answer to that is that burial is reversible, in the sense where if there's a lawsuit, again, it's all about the lawsuits. Something comes up, they can exhume the person, whereas with cremation, they can't reverse it. And so that's really the main thing they're thinking about is if someone did come out of the woodwork, and years later they would be able to exhume the person and put them wherever the family wanted them. So that's why they default to burial. The public health issue, I mean, I've tried everything with these bureaucrats, and they see it through such a bureaucratic lens that there's an answer for everything. So I brought that up, and they said, well, what about refrigeration? That prevents the bacteria by X amount, and we really don't think it's a problem. They said, unless you can prove that it's a health risk, that with refrigeration this person's going to be a public health hazard, which I disagree with, then they're not really interested. And so I thought of maybe conducting some sort of study measuring how much bacterial growth is on the body with refrigeration, how much is in the air, is there anything that could be, and I just want to go off on a little tangent real quick, because there's this, there's been two workers in the hospital that work near the morgue in the lab who have just complained to me that they're feeling sick, and I don't really smell anything. But it's something that I definitely wrote in a report so I could document it, that they're feeling sick due to or nauseous due to the smell of the unflamed. So I am trying to leverage that in the whole public health area as to a good reason why it is an issue, and it kind of negates their refrigeration prevents bacterial growth argument. There are some papers that are arguing against my point that it is very effective, but how effective really is it? So getting that across to a bureaucrat is the challenge. They like numbers, they like stats, they like definitive answers.
I'm going to take, because I'm holding the mic, I'm going to ask a question. And the first one is both for Anne and for you, Matt, and the second one maybe more for Matt. Has Japan kind of started using ancestry or DNA matching as much as the United States? And Matt, you had mentioned how if you are trying to track down, do your detective work, you're using. And I'm just wondering, do these DNA sites, have they changed their work? And I'm wondering in Japan if ancestry is a thing. And then secondly, you kind of alluded to this, Matt, but the whole idea of the corporate funeral home, does that mean that it's even less likely that the homes are going to take on these expenses because, in fact, they're owned by larger corporations? They don't have the family kind of like the Peter, what was his last name? Stefan example of someone who's committed to the community. And so it's like the corporate is in Omaha, so it doesn't really matter what their relationship with the community is. If you could talk a little bit about big funeral, but first the ancestry question.
So, thanks, Ron. So I don't, the issue about unclaimed is interesting in Japan because apparently it's not usually a matter of not being able to find kin. So I had an interview with a guy who worked in a municipality south of Tokyo, who said it used to be that the unclaimed were there because no they were unknown, they were unidentified, we didn't know who they were. The assumption was, well, we find out who they were, of course someone will claim because then we find their family members. He said now, almost universally, we know who their families are. Like you had said, we contact them and they say, no, we don't want to have anything to do with them because the relationship is strained, it's estranged, we're not going to be responsible. But on what you just said about, even though you said the second question wasn't Katie, this guy is doing something really innovative. And he is also pairing with funeral companies in the city, with city and funeral, making like a hybrid corporate municipal arrangement that if someone signs up ahead of time back to being repaired, they have to sign up ahead of time. And this is for people who qualify because they're poor. If they can sign up ahead of time and make an arrangement ahead of time, they won't claim. And that's with these funeral companies, and he's making a deal with them. And the way that he does that is that by making this deal ahead of time, they can capture national funds. Otherwise, they can't get federal funding. So if you can sign up ahead of time, then they're available. Those funds are available to them. So it's very clever. But he has to. So as part, the municipality is responsible. He's trying to get the nation state responsible, trying to get the person responsible to sign up ahead of time, and then these local funeral companies saying, "Hey, you're corporate. We're not going to give you quite as much as you otherwise could make, but you get something." And don't you have civic responsibility? So it's really just kind of an interesting arrangement.
Yes, yeah. So starting with the ancestry part, so it's helped in the sense where funeral homes are more willing to take the case if they have complete information that they have to fill out on the death certificate. So it's helped me again. You need the mother's name, you need the mother's maiden name, you need place of birth, things like that, and so. Ancestry has helped the finding the mother's maiden name, finding things like that, and it's made the funeral homes willing to accept the case because if I do all the work for them ahead of time, and they just have to plug it in. Plus, we pay them; they're definitely going to be more willing to take the case. And then the second part of the question. So for those who don't know, there's Service Corporation International (SCI). Who it's a corporate funeral conglomerate in the United States. Their HQ is in Houston, and so Massachusetts is very SCI friendly, very corporate friendly. Which I previously worked for SCI, and I can say that's kind of what made me start raising some of these questions after seeing some of their business practices and seeing how it's vastly different from your local funeral director, your Peter Stefan, how much different it is. You get a new price list twice a year. Okay, corporate just raised prices to this. Okay, corporate just raised prices to this. And then cemeteries find out about that. Other funeral homes find out about that. And they see that the corporate funeral homes are still getting business, and then they change their prices. They raise their prices. So the fact that and by the way, it's publicly traded. It's on the stock market. So I think more people should know about that, and if more people knew about that, I think something would be done because the idea of funeral poverty, it definitely is a contributing factor there when you have a big corporation essentially monopolizing funeral homes in their funeral homes that you wouldn't even know are corporately owned because they do these borderline unethical. You could, if you were a good lawyer, you could argue that it's ethical, but the average person would say that's not ethical. Where they keep the family name Johnson Funeral Home. Okay, it's still Johnson Funeral Home, but it's under corporate control. They're again down in Texas giving the orders to some director in Massachusetts saying you have to follow these, and they're very strict about it. If you don't collect money, if you don't meet the bottom line, it starts making the funeral director just think about numbers in meeting numbers, and I did not like that. I learned from a traditional funeral director, from a local small town funeral director, and it was just it's so different than how I learned to be a funeral director, and it truly is turning to solely a business when you have these corporate publicly traded interests kind of trying to buy up all the funeral homes they can and turn it into something that it shouldn't be. So I think if more people were aware of that, there would definitely be a little bit more outrage. But unfortunately, again, they operate under the guise of the family name, tell you that Mr. Johnson's just golfing right now. He's away. He's not here right now. And so it's just some of their business practices. If people knew about it, they would not be still going to those funerals. But they're still getting business, and they're still that stock prices and definitely still rising. Even during downturns in the market, they're still somehow still skyrocketing.
Great. Well, thank you so much to both of you.
Thank you all for coming on this very cold night.